Hey listeners, we're so glad you're a part of the listening family. Or if you're watching, we're so glad that you're watching the Missions Podcast in video form too. We're doing a lot of new and exciting things, and we want to hear from you. Now, you guys are always super good about leaving us notes when you're encouraged or when you have a question or even a critique. But what we want to do is ask the hard questions. And so we're offering a survey. The first 10 people that fill it out are going to receive a $10 gift card for Amazon or whatever online retailer, or maybe they just want to give that money back to a ministry of their choice. All of the options are there for you, but either way, we want to make it matter for the first 10 people that fill out our survey. We want to know what resonates best with you. We want to know what we can be doing to improve. We want to make sure that the content that we provide you with week in and week out is what's going to most equip you and encourage you in your ministry, whether you're at home, here in the States, or wherever you are in the world. We want it to be a blessing to you as well. So go to missionspodcast.com/survey in order to participate. That's missionspodcast.com/survey. And remember, the first 10 participants will receive a $10 Amazon gift card or a gift card to the place of their choice. Thank you for participating. Welcome to the Missions Podcast. This week's episode was recorded at the 2022 Missionary Enrichment Conference hosted in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, with ABWE missionaries from across the world. So whether you're a part of the ABWE global family of ministries or not, that's ministering across 84 nations, we hope that you're blessed by this content because it is a blessing to missionaries, pastors, and other people from across the world listening in. We hope you're encouraged by it. And now let's get to the show. It's pretty exciting, and we've got a guest here on the stage with me as well, who I'll introduce you in just a moment. We've also got broadcasting in the disembodied voice of Scott Dunford, pastor of Redeemer Church in Fremont, California. Scott, we wish that you were here. It's been a while since we've had ME, but it's been even a little bit longer since you've been at a missionary enrichment conference. I'm sure you're missing us as much as we're missing you.
Yeah, well, and it's also Carla's hometown, so I would love to have been there and gotten the sights and see the beautiful city of Pittsburgh, but alas, I'm stuck here in sunny California. What am I going to do?
Pray for him. We all have our crosses to bear, right? We love Scott. And for those of you that are kind of new to the ABWE family, or maybe this is the first episode of the podcast that you've watched or listening to, Scott was vice president of mobilization and communications at ABWE for how many years, Scott?
I've lost track. At least 3 years there at the headquarters, missionary before that, and I've continued on with ABWE since then. So I think I'm getting close to like 10 years kind of, or maybe it's even, I guess, counting pre-field, I guess it's closer to like 13 years, something like that. So, yeah.
Time flies when you're having fun. We love Scott. He's still a part of the ABWE family, even though he's not here in person, of course. But speaking of folks that are here in person, we have our guest here on the stage, Steve Chmil, and I'll allow you to introduce yourself, but then Scott, maybe you can talk to us a little bit about why we picked Steve. No offense, we love you, Steve.
Sure.
You're awesome. There's also 620 other missionaries here. So the question becomes like, okay, well, why Steve? Well, first of all, why not Steve? But go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we'll dive in.
So I'm Stephen Chmil. I'm a surgeon. I have just completed my first term in Togo, West Africa, and we've been back for a little under a month.
All right.
Well, it's good to have Steve with us, and there's a few reasons why I feel like it's great to have Steve on our show. One, you bring a unique perspective as a missionary doctor who's passionate about both things, medical care, but also really passionate about theological training and church planting. But beyond that, here you are kind of representing what I feel is probably a lot of missionaries here. You have some that are getting ready to go out on their first term, those that are coming back from their first time. Then, of course, we've got a whole host of veteran missionaries. And so having you on to talk about, hey, what were some of the ups and downs of life in your first term? What were some of the things that God taught you through that? What are the things that you wish other missionaries would know? And so I'm excited to have you just kind of share some of those heartbeats, as well as talk a lot more about this, the tension maybe that is there in missions between medical ministry, mercy ministry, and church planting and church leadership. So I'm excited to dive in with that. I hope that helps kind of set the stage a little bit.
Literally setting the stage, because we're on a stage today. It's just cool. We feel pretty important. We've arrived officially.
We don't usually do this on a stage.
We don't usually do this on a stage, but the world's a stage. But moving along anyways. So you felt a calling towards missions from a pretty young age. Was it high school?
It was my senior year of high school.
All right. So not super young adult, but still fairly early on in life.
And very early in my Christian life. I'd been a Christian a little under 2 years when the Lord called me into ministry.
Wow. Okay. And then you went to pursue, I assume, pre-med?
Yes, so I went to Bob Jones University and studied pre-med there, then on to medical school, and then seminary and practice and surgery residency and all the steps to get to where I am today.
So I don't want to make any blanket statements about you, but you're a surgeon. You've got a powerful testimony. You learn about Christ. You were called to the field, right? So you kind of have it all together a little bit, right?
I wish.
It seems that way from the outside. And so what was your first term like, and did that bubble get burst at all?
Well, so as we've mentioned, I had a very long period of time of preparation, over 20 years in actuality. So I had a long time to think about the theological and philosophical underpinnings of ministry and missions, and I had a plan and a vision in mind. And as the expression goes, no plan survives the battlefield. And so our time in Togo, I would wish I could say the very first term was hit the ground running and do all the ministry and service items that we had in mind and everything perfectly. But as most missionaries have to do, during the first term, you have to spend a significant amount of time learning the language and adapting to the culture. And for a medical doctor and for a surgeon like myself in particular, I had to spend a huge amount of time also expanding my skill set. So you get a certain framework in surgery residency, but no one does everything except a medical missionary. So we ended up having to learn lots of things such as orthopedics and obstetrics and to expand my skill set and then learn how to do it in a very resource-limited environment. And so most of my first term was spent adapting to the situation on the ground.
Oh, and then the pandemic to throw it in.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Other than that, everything was fine.
Everything was simple.
Yeah. Scott, why don't you cut in?
Yeah, it's one of those things, and I think probably a lot of our missionaries that are listening can kind of understand, whether they're medical or not. You hit the ground, and everything's hitting you in the face, and even just figuring out how to live can be a challenge. But there's also challenges spiritually. There's challenges emotionally. So what do you think missionaries need to know before they get to the field, especially if you're speaking specifically to our pre-fielders who are getting ready to go, or maybe those that are listening that are thinking about going into missions? What do you think missionaries need to know to prepare spiritually and emotionally for that first term on the field?
Oh, great question. I think spiritually, the thing I would say most is to make sure your roots go very, very deep. Spend the years of preparation to really ground yourself in the Word and in your faithfulness to the Lord, who will always be faithful to you. Because missionaries, by definition and by design, serve in a relatively dry place. And so you'll be far from the deep wells of your sending church. It may be years before you hear a sermon preached live by someone who knows you personally. And that is a great detachment. One of the things I'm very much looking forward to during our furlough year is sitting under the teaching of the Word, because you don't get as much of that. And so in the preparation time, I would say dig deep into the Word, learn about the promises of God, hide them in your heart, memorize as much of the Scripture as possible so that the Holy Spirit can bring it to mind when you most need it.
That's good. I need to do some of that myself.
We all do.
Yeah, amen. Well, one of the things we were talking about before we started recording, before our guests came and arrived, is that you were probably used to, I'd imagine, as a medical professional, doing certain things very, A to B, do this, achieve this result, probably very goal-oriented, I would imagine, with some of that. And one of the things that we talk about in the realm of missions is sometimes trying to avoid that mentality and expecting immediate success, rapid multiplication, things are just going to explode, right? We try to talk about being prepared to do the long, hard thing. In reality, I don't know if any of us ever fully expect that on the mission field. And so was the slowness of seeing fruit and seeing conversion or whatever, life change, whatever your metric is in your particular context in northern Togo, Mongo, which is predominantly Muslim, was the slowness of fruit there a challenge for you in Bethany?
It wasn't a surprise, but it was definitely a challenge. Surgeons especially get a reputation for being impatient, and we deserve that reputation. We tend to make a plan, enact the plan, and expect to see a result almost immediately. And evangelism is not like that. I personally had to hear the gospel presented to myself dozens of times over several months before my stubborn heart was enough to respond. And it takes time to evangelize, and it takes time to establish a church, because you have to evangelize an entire community and then ground them in the Word and then raise up leaders. That can take years, especially in another language and another culture. It could even take a lifetime.
Real quick, let me just dive a little bit deeper into that. So tell me about some of the conversations that you've had, because, okay, we think like Muslim ministry, but Muslim ministry in Togo is not the same as Muslim ministry in Bangladesh or in India or in Saudi Arabia. And so how open have those people been? What have those conversations been? Are they mostly just laying some groundwork? Have you been able to frequently present the entire gospel, or is it still very much in the kind of the tilling the soil phase?
Right now, it's a very early phase. The hospital has a great reputation, which brings a lot of people to our door, and they have an opportunity to hear the gospel. But we mostly celebrate when someone is willing to hear it at this point. There are a lot of people we have to understand as Americans and as Christians that we are asking them to not only embrace a new faith, but to turn their back on their old one, which has a large amount of their support system built into it. So they have to expect to be disowned by their family if they're even going to consider becoming a Christian, and that can be very hard for them.
And I'm just curious, I want to drive a little bit deeper. So you were converted at the end of high school. Was your upbringing as a believer?
No,
okay.
I was not part of the church until those first several months before I became a Christian.
So then there's a little bit of a point of contact there. You're not a lifelong Christian telling other people to do something you've never done. In a certain sense, you kind of had to give up on your own family, your own support system, having all those connections as intimate as they were, similar to the way in which you're asking Muslims to take that sort of step, be able to leave some of that behind in order to follow Christ.
Well, I did definitely have to come to Christ and realize the ramifications of what I was doing, and especially once I surrendered to go to the mission field, realizing I was going to be taking myself and later my family away from the rest of my family.
I think what you're highlighting is so crucial for us to remember. And I realize, some ways the foolishness of talking probably to, a whole group of missionaries that have understood a little bit about longevity and length, especially as, I don't know when you're celebrating the Baum Awards, if it's tonight or if it was yesterday, but we celebrate longevity. But here, Stephen, you've already set up the fact that it took 20 years of preparation to get to this point. And now you're entering into a whole nother season of long sowing kind of ministry. We are so programmed, I think, in our culture to just expect input in, input out. And yet the true gospel ministry, sometimes we never even get to see the full fruit of it. We're more like Abraham, looking for a city that we never get to find. And yet God calls us to be faithful to that and keeps us trudging through those waters. Have there been moments when you were really, as you were thinking through the slowness of things in your first term, where you had to draw back on some of those experiences and lessons that God had taught you in that 20 years previously of preparation?
I did have to spend some time with the Lord and struggling through many things. More of the time it was so busy that we had to deal with that. More so than just thinking about how slow it was. But it's slow on the things that we really came there to do, and that's to establish the church.
And if you'll pardon the digression a little bit, one of the things that we talk about in missiology is the dangers associated with insider movements. The idea that somebody doesn't have to leave their socio-religious community, whether as a Muslim or some other majority religion in a non-Christian culture, that they don't have to leave that whole construct behind in order to follow Christ. And while we want to be sensitive and recognize, people do have to count the cost, we also recognize that's what we're calling them to do, that they're taking that step and that they are losing something in order to follow Christ. What I don't think we always bring into that conversation is so often it's Western missionaries that are involved in perhaps starting or encouraging some of those movements that we would look at and say, I'm not sure that's biblically faithful. I don't think it is biblically faithful. And yet a missionary such as yourself in a Muslim context, well, you've done that exact thing. You had to leave your community, your culture. And so as you're sharing the gospel with Muslims, you're not necessarily asking them to do so much more than what you've done in a certain sense. You had to turn your back on your home in a lot of ways in order to follow Christ onto the mission field. And I think that gives your testimony and your message to them evangelistically a lot more weight and force behind it there. I think that something else, and we can transition here a little bit too, is that ABWE, in addition to preaching the gospel boldly that way, being evangelistic, has always had medical missions really at the heart of who we are. Not because we're more passionate about that than other forms of ministry. It just happens to be near and dear to us. Our founder, Raphael Thomas, was a medical doctor, and so that's always been kind of core. And so how have you approached that on your first term? You had certain expectations, I'm sure, of being able to balance your time a certain way. And did those expectations pan out?
Sure. Very good question. During the years of preparation, when we were really trying to develop our philosophy, we recognized that all Christians, whether they're missionaries or not, are called to do two things, and that is to preach grace and to practice mercy. And how we do them, the amount of time we spend might vary from one believer to another, and the manner in which we do it will definitely differ from one person to another. And for us, on the medical side, obviously the mercy ministry that we show is by treating the sick and helping the injured. But we're not just there to do that. We also came with eternity in mind, to recognize that there are eternal stakes to the people we're dealing with as well. If I may very, very loosely paraphrase the scripture, what does it profit us if we help people have long, healthy, and prosperous lives and stand by while they lose their own souls? That would be a tragedy. And so while we do come to show mercy, and that is an integral part of why we're there, it's not the only reason we're there. So we're also there trying to share the gospel message as well. But the balance between them, that is the hard part.
And I'm curious how it works in your particular hospital clinical setting too, because I know of some settings like that in the ABWE world where it's sort of like, well, we've got one missionary, maybe it's an indigenous worker, somebody that comes in, they're our social worker, you know, kind of air quotes around that, but really their role is to be the evangelist, and every patient there gets prayed with, every patient there gets a story of hope presented to them, something like that. But it sounds like it's a little bit different because you're still working even in that, patient doctor setting for just the hearing itself. So how do you pry that open in your 9 to 5?
Well, there is no 9 to 5 in surgery, but there is a large number of people who have contact with the respective patients who come to the hospital. So there's obviously the doctors themselves, there's the nurses, there's the phlebotomists who come and draw blood, there's the radiology techs who meet the patients, and then we also have a group of chaplains as well.
I'm sorry, did anyone have on their bingo card that they would hear the word phlebotomist from the stage here at ME? Because I didn't. Go ahead, continue.
Fair enough.
They're doing bingo now at ME? Oh man, I missed out.
Each of those people does have a chance to have a contact with the patient, and depending on the patient's personality and depending on the individual relationship and time you have with them, some people are going to naturally have a stronger connection with one patient versus another. So as their surgeon and as someone who helps them, my hope is that I would have a large impact in their life and be open to have opportunities to speak truth into their lives. But there's also chaplains who are from the various Togolese tribes in the area who know the culture and know the language. And so sometimes they are better suited to talk. So it really just depends on the patient's preferences. Some of them don't want to talk to the chaplains and would rather talk to a physician. Some don't want to talk to the physicians, would rather talk to the chaplains. It's a very patient dependent.
I want to explore that tension there that you guys deal with, especially as surgeons or as nurses. What are the conversations like? I mean, I realize you probably don't want to pull the curtain all the way back, but for those of us on the outside of that type of work, I look at what you guys do, especially as surgeons and the medical people. That I know the hours you're working. I've sat in enough of the medical team's meetings to know that there's just that overwhelming sense of, people are dying and there's so many needs. And yet I know I was there when you were recruited. I remember sitting through your doctrinal exams and hearing your heartbeat for training and for church planting. How are the ways that doctors and nurses are wrestling through doing those both? Like what do those conversations look like as you're trying to find the right balance? And I realize balance is maybe a joke for some of you, but how do you tease that out? Or what are those conversations looking like on the ground?
You mean the balance between our church planting evangelism side and the mercy ministry side?
Right. And how are you working out your time? Like I just know that you guys are incredibly busy. So what does that look like as you're trying to sort through how to do those things?
I don't always sleep. That goes away pretty easy. But it really becomes a question of trying to pray for wisdom and seek the best idea. It's amazing to me that there are portions of the scripture that we just gloss over until we're ready to see what was going on. So, for instance, I never even paid the slightest bit of attention to the fact that Jesus would get into a boat to preach to people. But he did it in a part, at least, to get away from the crowds, because he was there on the shore, he was healing, he was casting out demons, he was practicing mercy. But then the time and the needs just kept coming. They never, ever stop, and they don't stop in Togo either. But Jesus made the decision to stop and to get into the boat and to preach the message. And so as his followers, we need to do the same thing. There are times that we are called to stand on the shore and to show and practice mercy, and there are times we need to get into the boat and to preach. And when to do them is a question that takes a lot of wisdom, and it's sometimes dependent on the individual missionary and what they feel and are prepared to do, but it also really depends on praying and seeking after God's wisdom to find the right way to make that happen.
That's really helpful. That even makes me think of early in the book of Acts when the first deacons are called, Stephen and some of the others there, and the apostles recognize that, well, we don't want to leave the work of the word and prayer, and so they give off some of those physical tasks and the mercy ministry within the body of Christ to those servants. Now, for them, it was an easy role division. You know, apostles, elders, and then deacons are over here. We're doing the spiritual work. They're engaged more on the physical side. You know, for you, you're kind of bridging both worlds. You kind of have a foot, you know, in both sides of that. But there is a division there. There is a distinction there. That's really helpful. And why is it, though, that that's helpful, particularly in Togo? Because on the one hand, the further north you go, it's kind of a microcosm of Africa, right? The further north you go, the more Islamic it is.
Absolutely.
And so you're dealing with some resistance. And I think, obviously, we're in a room with several missionaries here. We understand the idea that talking about a person's physical needs and meeting those needs is going to open doors to spiritual conversations. But even beyond that, what is it about Togo that makes that strategic as a place to be showing mercy ministry? And what are those needs that exist?
Sure. Mercy ministry, which doesn't just include medical sides. I mean, there can be things such as education and literacy and economic development. Many things can fit under the umbrella of mercy ministries, but they can really do at least three things for a potential missionary to use. One, it gives them the chance to follow in the footsteps and example of Jesus and his disciples. Jesus obviously went about doing good, as Acts 10 says, and healing many. Peter, his disciple, did the same thing throughout the book of Acts. Paul did the same thing. He healed, and even his co-laborers, such as Luke, were often treating as well. It is a ministry that is given to all of us, so it gives a chance we're in good company when we do spend time in mercy ministries. But it also gives us an opportunity to get into places that might otherwise be either closed or difficult. Some countries are clearly closed, and you can't get in as a traditional missionary, but a medical worker certainly could. A doctor, a nurse, an allied health professional could get in. Some countries, like Togo, are officially open. I mean, the central government has no problem with someone coming in, but there are regions and there are people groups that probably would not embrace a foreign missionary coming in and wondering why they're coming at all. But if they come to show genuine compassion and do works of mercy, then they can be open and embraced and get a reputation. And then that leads to the third thing, which makes their message that they're bringing open and sensitive to listen to. So people who would genuinely, naturally reject the message of the gospel, when they see it lived out and it's showing compassionate love to them in the works that we do, that can hopefully soften the hearts and make them more willing to listen and more willing to accept.
So tell us a little bit more. What would the team there in northern Togo want all of us to know about how the gospel is advancing, particularly in your region, the northern Muslim region of Togo?
I think they'd want outsiders to realize that this is a long process, a generational process, because we sometimes get the expectation that the end of the story is what we're going to see immediately. And I think if we brought any of the heroic missionaries of the past, if you brought them in after 4, 5, 10 years, they would talk about how they were in the midst of something and they hadn't seen all the fruit yet. I mean, if you were to pull Adoniram Judson out of Burma or Carey out of India or Hudson Taylor out of China 5 or 10 years into their development, their fruit would have been small. But by the time the Lord was done with them and done with the work, it was magnificent. And that's what we're expecting to see in Togo, but we are still in the midst of very early development in the north.
I'm sorry, I thought you could just start an explosive movement that would immediately take everything over, kind of microwave the whole thing.
The surgeon in me wishes that was true.
Even though surgery isn't exactly quick, right?
Not all the time, yeah.
Can you talk to me a little bit, speaking of, about the precision that you face in your line of work as a surgeon, but then also the theological precision that you approach your task with? Because obviously, we're all part of ABWE. We all believe doctrine matters. We're here because we believe the gospel. We take the Bible literally, all those sorts of things. But I know you're sending church. Shout out to Grace Bible Fellowship Church in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, our sister church, the sister church of the church where I attend. And so there's some connections there.
Absolutely.
But I know doctrinally, it's a robust church. So why does precision matter as you approach some of those things where you're balancing between physical needs and spiritual needs and the Islamic context, but also being bold and all of that? How does the precision help you there?
Well, in surgery, it's pretty clear. Precision matters because you have a very narrow range where you can do good and everything else is doing harm. And I would say theology and missions in general is the same way, that you have a very narrow way in which you can present the truth and get people grounded in the truth, and then on either side is lots of error. And especially when you're in a place where the church has not been before, these are people who are going to grapple and struggle with all of the early churches' struggles and things they had to grapple with. The early church, we like to think of them as having it all together, but they had to discuss and debate things such as the deity of Christ and the nature of sin and whether it was universal in man and whether man could earn his salvation. And when you go to a very new place, the people are going to have those exact same questions. And so while in the American church, we like to talk about how there's a great need for pastor theologians, I think there's also on the mission field a need for missionary theologians, people who are well-trained and able to get through all of the difficult struggles theologically that people may have and find ways to address them that they can understand and that they can grow through.
That's a great point, because I think there's sometimes in the mission world where I've heard it presented in such a way that says, hey, those that, all of you in our pews have more theological training than some of these pastors have. And so the idea could be in someone's head that you can go to the mission field with just a little bit of Sunday school knowledge and do a lot of good because they don't even know those Bible stories. But what I think you're rightly pointing out is that when there is no theological foundation that's already been laid, more care has to be given, more precision has to be done. So as missionaries, be students of the word, but also be students of theology and even be students of church history so that you can understand some of these errors when they pop up and also recognize you're not the first one to have experienced that. I think that is great advice and great help.
Yeah, there's absolutely nothing new under the sun. I think it's Carl Trueman has said on multiple occasions that kind of the tip of the spear of heresy is usually on the mission field for whatever reason, because it's with the best of evangelistic motives that you kind of contextualize and you tweak and you maybe cut off a corner and you cut too far, and all of a sudden you're ministering among Muslims and oh shoot, now I'm an Arian, you're committing some early church sort of Christological heresy or something like that. Of course, nobody in this room, but missions community in general, hypothetically, this could happen from time to time. But as you're wanting to see the number of co-laborers that you have grow, I think it's important. I want to talk a little bit about mobilization and some of the opportunities to serve in just a moment. But even within ABWE, we've kind of gone through a metamorphosis in the last several years of thinking of training more as a one-size-fits-all to now sort of a customizable, and wherever you're coming from and whatever past experiences, we're going to kind of clip you out of some things, some courses and competencies that you might already have. And I think there's a good emphasis on efficiency there. But at the same time, we don't want to water that down. Theological preparation is important because just like you're saying, you can't go kind of in a slipshod, half knowledgeable sort of way and then end up accidentally committing one of these grave errors, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So talk to me while we're trying to mobilize people that are prepared, that value precision, but also just kind of a normal person thinking, well, I'm not Steve Chmil. I'm not a surgeon. I'm not a theologian. What role could I possibly play in a place like Northern Togo?
Well, a team like Northern Togo is so big that it really is a microcosm of a church body in the fact that we all have different roles, we all have different gifts. Not everyone has to do exactly the same things, but we all need to work together in harmony to make the work go forward. And so some may come in and they are medical doctors, and that is what they are skilled at. They are not going to do surgery. Some are going to be surgeons, and they are going to do the surgical side well. They are not going to do a lot of the general medical things. Some come in with theological training and really are passionate about doing that, and they should be allowed and given the opportunities to express that calling as the Lord has called them to do so. So it really just finds a way for the team to be harmonious in its diverse gifts and find a way to make them all work together for the glory of Christ and for the establishment of his church.
So I'm speaking to the ABWE family that's here, that's listening or watching after the fact, but also to the outside of our organization audience that also consumes this content. So there's kind of a reputation that ABWE has in the missions world that we're doing a ton of stuff in Togo. And if you pick up our magazine, if you go to our website, you're going to hear about Togo. That's kind of the in-joke within our organization. There's a lot about Togo. There's other places too, but for whatever reason, all the photos, the articles, they all come out of Togo. What you're saying is, though, in the north especially, don't assume that there isn't a need for more teammates.
You could double our laborers and there'd still be enough work to go around.
Well, yeah, for sure. So prayerfully consider that. Again, not you guys. You already have fields. Everybody else out there listening and watching after the fact. Scott, any parting words or questions for Steve?
Well, yeah, just as you look down the road and you see, hey, this is where we have a vision for what we'd like to see happening in Togo. What are the things you see ahead of you that are going to be some of the biggest challenges? And also, as you look at some of those things, what are some of those opportunities for people to hey, we're going to have opportunities down the road for some other gifts that we currently don't have right now?
So challenges are going to be continuing to see the people's hearts soften to the gospel and start to be able to accept it. One thing I was surprised at when we arrived in Togo was that there is a huge percentage of the population who do not speak French, which is the language we all spent our time learning. And so there's importance for missionaries to even try to learn some of the tribal languages to, at the very minimum, connect with the patients on a personal level, and then maybe even at some point in the future be able to teach at those levels. Those are some of the challenges. There's always going to be challenges from the workload and from the need for wisdom, but there's also many opportunities. So there are patients who are coming to us not just from Togo, but from the surrounding countries. We get them from Ghana, Benin, and Burkina Faso regularly, and sometimes even as far as Nigeria and the Ivory Coast. And so we're bringing people in from really far away, and it's a good opportunity for them to come in, even if we don't have missionaries where they are, so they can at least hear the gospel during their time there with us. So that's one opportunity. Another opportunity that's recently developing is the opportunity to train Togolese. We've had for a while now the nursing school, and we're in our second generation of that. And so any nurses who feel a passion for teaching can come in and teach some of the Togolese to become nurses and to teach them the Bible as well, because that's part of their curriculum. And then we are also trying to start a PACS program, which is a residency in surgery for doctors who have already completed their medical school. They are African. They have professions of faith. We do screen them to try to make sure that that is a genuine profession of faith, but then they have a Bible curriculum in addition to their surgical training. And so that's another opportunity going forward. And so some doctors who maybe can't go on the mission field for a career could still come and teach courses to these prospective residents.
So PACS, that's Pan-African Association of Christian Surgeons. And
Pan-African Academy.
And so these are African believers who are being trained as medical professionals who would come to the missionary hospital in Mongo and then would go out to other parts of Africa basically as indigenous medical missionaries.
Part of the expectation from getting the surgical training is that they would go and turn and work in an underserved and missionary type environment.
Very cool. That's inspiring, I think, for any of the missionaries here anyway, just thinking long term, like what would this look like ideally in my ministry 10, 15, 20 years down the road of seeing indigenous people not only saved, sent out as missionaries themselves, continuing the work of mission there. So Steve, we're incredibly grateful for you and for your whole family and for the whole team in North Togo, and we appreciate you being here today.
Thank you very much. It's been fun.
Right. And for those of you that attended here, again in person, we're so glad that you could join us. And for the rest of you who are watching and listening, the Missions Podcast is a ministry of ABWE. To get more, go to missionspodcast.com. You can support the ministry at missionspodcast.com/support. And while you're there, remember to leave a positive rating, positive review that helps get this in front of other people that can see the content and be blessed by it. And so until our next episode from the Missionary Enrichment Conference here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which for us is tomorrow in this same room at the same time, 4 p.m., but for you is probably a full week away. Thanks for watching and listening.